There are many reasons given as to why the British wanted to do a landing in Dieppe in 1942, seen as a landing in force, or a large raid in effect. One reason was to alleviate pressure on Stalin's forces in Russia by trying to tie down more German forces in France. Another was that the RAF now had a harder time at drawing the Luftwaffe into a fight after losing the Battle of England, crossing the Channel, thus now instead having to fly deeper into France where they would be attacked by German fighters and the pilots not being able to be recovered. And the thought was that to attack a port city would then draw the German flyers out in force so they could destroy them. Another was simply to gain experience in how to conduct beach landings before the main event in Normandy. Honestly, none of these reasons seems very good, but Churchill was hell-bent on appeasing Stalin, who was pressuring the Allies to do something, citing that he was currently doing all the fighting. And this seems the main reason to launch a large raid. Or, having an abundance of Canadians at his disposal, Churchill went ahead to that end. Churchill had put Admiral Mountbatten in charge and personally briefed him that he wanted raids of increasing intensity, developing equipment and training with the view to the invasion of France. Dieppe was within RAF fighter range and with a port and relatively shallow beach approaches, thus it was chosen. The first plan was made to this end, but there were problems. Mountbatten had charming abilities, certainly, but little actual experience in terms of warfare. Not being made easier by the combined operations headquarters, they proposed flanking landings that would take Dieppe in a pincer movement. However, home forces argued for a frontal attack, as, within the 15-hour window of a raid, the flank attacks would not have enough time to achieve success. Mountbatten argued that it would suffice for the raid to show that the tactic would have worked. Montgomery countered that if the raid did not take Dieppe proper, it would be seen as a failure. An initial heavy bombardment from the air was approved, despite serious concerns about civilian casualties. However, that was then rescinded due to the Army opinion that the wreckage would simply block streets for the tanks and RAF belief that most of the bombs would end up in the sea or further inland anyway. So much for confidence in one's own ability. Mountbatten then asked for battleships for shore bombardment in lieu of bombing. But neither this nor even cruisers were permitted him. And to make things worse, combined operations, proposed assault forces of Marines and Commandos was passed over in favor of untried Canadian troops. Skipping forward many arguments later, Operation Rudder was designed. 67 squadrons from the RAF was set aside, but only a few Hunt-class destroyers was allowed for support, and airborne landings by gliders to take out the German batteries, along with 4 landing points on the coast. Of course, the landings were rehearsed, but not particularly successful. However, the operation was still set for somewhere between the 4th and 8th of July 1942. However, on July 7th, the Luftwaffe bombed several of the assembly ships, and now, fearing that the plan had been compromised, which it somewhat had, as the Germans had noticed an increase in radio and naval traffic, Rudder was cancelled. The troops disembarked and returned to their other duties. And given over 10,000 soldiers and sailors had been involved, it is very credible to think that it would have been sooner or later known to the Germans. Montgomery suggested cancelling it entirely out of this concern. However, Mountbatten and Churchill was not so easily swayed. Mountbatten began to plan a new raid 6 weeks later. His argument was that although the enemy must have found out that Dieppe had been the original target, quoting, "the very last thing they, the Germans, ever imagined is that we would be so stupid as to lay on the same operation again." End quote. And yes, I'm not kidding. And yes, they were. And no, they weren't. Enter Operation Jubilee. where the main difference was that no longer gliders or airborne troops were involved. But now commando forces were going to take out the coastal guns on either side of town, landed by regular landing crafts slightly ahead of the main forces headed to Dieppe. The landings were planned for 6 beaches, 4 in the town itself, and 2 to the eastern and western side of Dieppe, from east to west. The beaches were codenamed Yellow, Blue, Red, White, Green, and Orange. The targets for commanders would be the coastal batteries near Berneval-les-Grands to the east, and the coastal batteries Vainville-sur-Mer to the west. Commandos would therefore perform a pincer movement from the flanks. Also, there were 50 American commandos assigned to the various British units. The Royal Regiment of Canada was to land on Blue Beach and conduct a flanking attack to the east of Dieppe. On the western flank, the Southern Saskatchewan Regiment and the Queen's Own Cameroon Highlanders would land on Green Beach and attack Pourville to destroy radar stations nearby. The South Saskatchewan Regiment was to secure the bridgehead, and the Queen's Own Cameroon Highlanders of Canada would land 30 minutes later to proceed inland and secure the airfield at Reuben, and, if time permitted, the German divisional headquarters located nearby. The main assault of the 4th Canadian Infantry Brigade in the centre would be done by 2 battalions, Essex Scottish on Red Beach and Royal Hamilton Light Infantry on White Beach. The attack in the centre would be supported by the 14th Canadian Tank Regiment, equipped with 58 brand new Churchill tanks, seeing their first combat. The main objective of the 4th Canadian was to seize and hold the town until engineers had destroyed port installations, cut telephone lines, and completed other tasks. According to the plan, the attacking forces were then to be evacuated by the ships and transport back to England after all objectives are completed, home in time for tea and biscuits. Right, no problem there. Now, to maintain the element of surprise, the mass aerial and naval bombardment was not part of the plan. The RAF was, however, to provide close air support and fighter cover over the area. 6 Navy destroyers were to provide protection of troop transports and artillery support from the sea. The attack by the commandos would go in first at 4:50 a.m., and the main assault force was scheduled for 5:20. Dieppe and the flanking cliffs were well defended. 1,500-strong garrison from the 302nd Static Infantry Division, comprised of the infantry regiments 570th, 571st, and 572nd, each of 2 battalions. The 302nd Artillery Regiment, 302nd Reconnaissance Battalion, 302nd Anti-Tank Battalion, 302 Engineer Battalion, 302 Signal Battalion. They were deployed along the beaches of Dieppe and the neighboring towns, covering all likely landing places. The city and ports were protected by heavy artillery on the main approaches, particularly in cliff caves, and with a reserve to the rear. The defenders were stationed in the towns and intervening opening areas and highlands that overlooked the beaches. Elements of the 571st Infantry Regiment defended Dieppe's radar station near Pourville, and the artillery battery over the river and Vainville. To the east, the Infantry Regiment 57th was deployed near the artillery battery at Berneval-les-Grands. The coast itself was protected by the barbed wire, obstacles, minefields, machine gun emplacements, and bunkers overlooking the beach. The coastal gun batteries were manned by naval detachments, and anti-aircraft batteries in the area were manned by Luftwaffe personnel. Up here on the cliffs overlooking the city, it's easy to see just what a task the defenders had. They just had to sit up here and shoot down over the beaches. The fortress up here was used by the Germans as an officers' casino during this time, and some of the Canadian troops actually managed to capture it, but they were quickly pushed out, and the defenses continued. But from here it is clear to see what an enviable position the defenders actually had, and what a view of the beaches and landing places they indeed possessed. So here on the very height of the bluff, it's one of the observation posts. It has a close protection for the rear of this, and they really have covered these up, disguised them. Here's another, and here's the steel door sitting on the ground. This is nice and dark, very cool. Oh, cool. Oh, look at this, this is awesome. You can actually get all the way in. So, at the time where the British had started landing on Dieppe, the Germans would be sitting in here watching all the landing craft approach, tuned all their artillery towards them, and the landing forces were just having a really bad day. From here, you can see, you can watch the entire coastline unhindered. The Canadian commanders were seen standing on the beaches, waving them off. They knew the landings had failed. My question about these landings is why? Why would you try to land with a small force of some 5,000 Canadians to appease the Russians? Just to try to test the German defenses? You knew that there's every bit of a chance that this force would be beaten, defeated, and not return. Of course, after the landings, Churchill put out that this was a success. They tested the German defenses. Now they learned something for D-Day, and I'm sure they did learn something for D-Day, which took place several years later. However, they lost a lot of good men, including tanks and landing crafts, which gave the Germans, number one, a huge propaganda victory, for one, and second, they gave them a good insight in what the Allies might do when they finally landed in Normandy. Germans had some 500 casualties, killed and wounded, but not nearly the amount that the Allies did. This is actually very large. This is the compartment where, the living compartment, crew compartment you see here on the walls. You have the bed hangers are still here, which is actually kind of cool that it's still here. There's a sign here, and it's been graffitied over. Too much graffiti, granted. And here's the emergency exit. There it is, the emergency exit. It's actually been dug out. Bricks in there. That's kind of cool. Like one last bed here for the room. Well. Last room to the defensive close protection compartment here. Sliding door still there. One little ventilation. I'm sure there was not a hill outside back in the day. Might have been a staircase. There's probably a staircase underneath there. But this is just one out of many bunkers the Germans had placed here to watch for exactly what happened. And there's some indication that they were warned it was going to happen. Although the Allies did come up with a whole lot of interesting stories as to why this actually was a success. I don't know how losing almost 3,000-4,000 men in a day and a lot of equipment is a success though, but we'll get into that. Up here is the remains of a German flak battery with an anti-aircraft cannon. It's easy to see how you can dominate the entire approaches to the beach here and also observe the skies. You can see miles away and plot any planes that comes anywhere near you. as well as ships, and direct fire for the other batteries. But before it even began, it had gone wrong. The Germans picked up on increased radio traffic and spotted the masked landing crafts at the ports opposite them. And lastly, a French double agent had warned them that the Allies were currently very interested in Dieppe. So they knew something was going on and was already on high alert by the time the invasion force set sail. Not knowing any of this were the soldiers and sailors in the 237 ships and landing crafts which now set up. On board these ships were more than 6,000 assault troops and many more Navy sailors, RAF forward observers. Overall, more than 10,000 men were involved altogether. And then it began to unravel, already at 3:57, as the force encountered 3 German naval vessels who immediately opened fire, and many ships and landing crafts were damaged during the 1-hour naval battle. Some of them so much so they had to return to England. Some stayed near the escort ships for protection of these. The decision was then made to cancel the landing on Yellow Beach. However, 7 landing craft without communication continued, determined to press on with their attack. 6 of these 7 crafts, with approximately 120 men, under the command of Captain Richard Willis, moved to Yellow Beach, and only 1 landing craft, with just 20 men under the command of Captain Peter Young, moved to Yellow 2 Beach. Captain Willis had a handful of U.S. Army Rangers. They reached Yellow 1 Beach at 5:15, late. The battle out to sea and on other beach landings already being fought alerted the Germans, who had taken up positions and opened fire on the landing crafts as they approached the shore. Those not outright killed in the boats reached the shelter of the cliffs where they tried to regroup, and out of sheer bravery they managed to get inland somewhat, but the Germans assembled reinforcements quickly, stopped their advance, and eventually pushed them back to their landing crafts, which had either been sunk or withdrawn under the heavy fire, and they had little other option but to surrender. Of the 120 men that landed on Yellow 1 Beach, 37 had been killed. On Yellow 2 Beach, the small party under the command of Peter Young landed on the shore at 4:45 unopposed. They quickly left the beach, cutting the barbed wire, moving inland undetected. The 20-man strong force encountered the German defenses around the artillery battery. Now clearly outnumbered and not able to destroy this, they started a small arms firefight from a distance, just enough to disrupt the gun crews from firing for a moment. As they ran out of ammunition, they then retreated back to the same landing crafts that brought them on the shore and returned back to England. So this part could be said to be a successful raid in itself. They came, they raided, and they returned alive. On the western end of the landing area, commando forces were split into 2 main groups and headed to their designated beaches. The smaller of the 2 groups, under the command of Major Miles Roberts, landed on Orange 1 Beach according to schedule, undetected, reaching his designated position at 5:40, still undetected. The main force of the 4th Commando landed on Orange 2 Beach, under the fire of the 2 German machine guns located in pillboxes on the cliffs overlooking the beach. Although with losses, they quickly did move inland and managed to destroy the machine gun pillboxes on their way. At 5:30 they reached the planned position right behind the coastal battery, engaging the landing forces currently. Major Roberts immediately ordered his troops to engage the battery with small arms and with their small 2-inch mortar. The second mortar grenade hit the battery's ammunition storage. It blew up spectacularly, and all the guns fell silent, and chaos arose in the German lines. The commandos then attacked the battery in a short firefight, and the battery was overrun. After a successful mission, the men of the 4th Commando went back to the beach, taking with them all their wounded, and a group of captured Germans without any problems. They boarded their landing crafts at 8:15 a.m. and went back to England, losing 16 men and another 7 captured. Further to the east from here, in an area designated Blue Beach, this is where I am today, a Royal Regiment of Canada started their approach. Blue Beach was very narrow and in front of the village of Poised. The mission depended mostly on the element of surprise, but that was no longer possible. The German defenders waited, and the attack on the narrow Blue Beach became a massacre. The German machine gun fire was devastating. Most of the 554 men of the Royal Regiment of Canada were killed still in their boats. Those who managed to reach the coast were pinned down by the sea wall without any chance to move forward. Very few managed to reach the village. All of them were either killed or captured. Out of 554 men, only 64 managed to get back to England. It was the Royal Regiment of Canada who landed here at Poised. They had attached the regiments of the soldiers of the Black Watch and 2 artillery units for some reason. They landed here on Blue Beach just as dawn broke. On a narrow beach, flanked on both sides by high cliffs, defended by several German machine gun positions and a pillbox, which completely dominated the landing beaches themselves and the egress point into town. It was a slaughter for the men who landed here. The element of surprise had been long lost before they landed, and the Germans were waiting. With only a narrow point off the beach into the even more narrow streets of the city, the Canadians never had a chance here. They fought valiantly, and they tried. It makes one wonder how the intelligence could have gotten it this wrong. And even if they made it off the beach into the narrow streets, they were flanked by cliffs themselves, and it would all have been very easy to defend by the Germans. Many of the men were mowed down by machine gun crossfire just as they were leaving the landing crafts, trying to reach the seawall. While running on an unstable, rocky beach, the casualty numbers here were staggering. On Green Beach, the South Saskatchewan Regiment landed on time at 4:50, without significant problems. However, one crucial mistake was made. According to the plan, B and C companies were supposed to land on the eastern bank of the river, and companies A and D on the western bank. As they approached the shore in the dark during the night, all companies, however, managed to land on the western bank. That meant that companies B and C would have to cross a small and very well-defended bridge to complete their objective. German positions completely dominated the area, and all attempts of a river crossing were stopped. Although parts of South Saskatchewan Regiment managed to cross the bridge eventually, destroying several German positions on the way, progress to the eastern bank of the river was stopped very soon by fierce German resistance. The landing of the Queen's Own Cameroon Highlanders of Canada was intentionally delayed for additional 30 minutes. As well, the bulk of the battalion was also landed on the wrong western bank of that river outlet. The decision was made to move inland from the western side. The group that landed on the eastern bank were ordered to join and help the South Saskatchewan, while the rest of the battalion made their advance. although the Queen's Own Cameroon Highlanders managed to penetrate further inland than any other troops that day. Their progress was eventually also stopped by arriving German reinforcements. Unlike the other beaches, where the element of surprise had been crucial, the main attack at Dieppe started with a short naval and air bombardment. The 4 naval destroyers opened fire for 10 minutes before the infantry landings. At the same time, RAF planes attacked the buildings near the beach with bombs and cannon fire. The second wave of RAF bombers dropped smoke bombs to protect the advancing landing crafts. The attack on Dieppe relied on the attack from the flanks. However, both of these had stalled or failed outright. This allowed German defenders to concentrate on the approaching force, consisting of the Essex Scottish and Royal Hamilton Light Infantry Battalion. However, the initial landings on White and Red Beach went without major problems. The troops landed on the shore with relatively few casualties, facing limited resistance initially. However, while still on the beach, trying to make their way through the barbed wire, the shingles, stones, the Canadians were suddenly faced with devastating machine gun and mortar fire, and that was only the beginning. The Germans had recovered from the bombardment and were back in their positions, firing at them from all directions. The situation on the beach became chaos. Everyone tried to find cover. German snipers prevented almost any movement on the beach. Most of the officers were dead. Any further advance was impossible. And now the arrival of the tanks from the 14th Canadian should have salvaged that battle. However, most of the tanks immediately got stuck in the soft shingles. Those tanks that managed to get off the beach faced concrete tank obstacles, which prevented them from moving off the seafront. However, encouraged by the arrival of the tanks, small groups of Canadians managed to fight their way to the city, and they even occupied the first few buildings closest to the beach. Some groups even managed to penetrate deeper into the city, but were inevitably forced back by German counterattacks. The commander of the landings, Major General John Roberts, was at his headquarters ship. He knew that the assault was not going according to plan, but he couldn't see much through the smokescreen laid. He decided to send all of his available reserves into action. The Fusiliers, Mount Royal Battalion, was sent in to help the Essex Scottish on Red Beach, and the Royal Marine Commando was sent on White Beach. Arriving on Red Beach at 7 a.m., the Fusiliers only shared the fate of those already there, trying to seek cover and stay alive. The landings of the Royal Marines on White Beach had been cancelled on their approach, but 2 of the landing crafts had not been reached. Unaware, they made it to the shore. None of those Royal Marine Commandos ever returned to England. By 9 a.m., it had become clear to everyone that the attack had failed. There was nothing left to do but evacuate the troops. Major General Roberts ordered a withdrawal to start at 10:30. However, because of the fixed RAF schedule, the withdrawal was postponed for an additional 30 minutes after that order had been given. The South Saskatchewan Regiment and the Cameroons on Green Beach timed their withdrawal on the beach at 10. The delay of that evacuation now put them in the open, closing their perimeter too soon, and that allowed the Germans to retake the positions from which they could cover the entire beach with deadly fire. During the chaotic evacuation, 2 battalions on Green Beach lost more men than in all of the heavy fighting during the morning. A similar situation played out on the beaches in front of Dieppe. By 12:15, the evacuation was over and the guns fell silent. Also in the sky there had been an aerial battle during those landings, and it was a significant one, as hoped for. The landings had indeed brought out the Luftwaffe, and they could be engaged by the RAF. However, not with the outcome the Royal Air Force had expected. They lost 106 aircraft and pilots, while the Luftwaffe lost 48 aircraft but recovered most of their pilots. The Royal Navy lost 33 landing crafts, and the destroyer Berkeley suffered 550 dead and wounded. The losses on the ground were horrific. Out of approximately 5,000 men who participated in the operation, the Canadian infantry lost 3,367 men, of whom 962 were killed. The rest were wounded or captured. Out of the 1,000 commandos, 270 men were killed, wounded, or captured. The Germans lost 311 men, with another 280 wounded. All of the Churchill tanks that went to shore were lost or captured, only to be tested by the Germans. No German forces were sent from Russian campaigns to defend France because of this. But the lessons were of course learned to be implemented in all future landings by both sides. Although Churchill, Eisenhower, and Mountbatten collectively starved off any blame for the outcome, Mountbatten bore the brunt of it. He was, however, reluctant to accept the blame and shifted it to peripheral reasons by passing apologetic and sometimes rather insensitive remarks. Intelligence on the area had also been limited and wrong. There were dug-in German machine gun positions in the cliffs, but these had not been detected. The planners had assessed the beach gradient and its suitability for tanks only by scanning holiday snapshots, which led to an underestimation of the German strength and certainly also of the terrain. Intelligence reports indicated that Dieppe was not heavily defended and that the beaches in the vicinity were suitable for landing infantry and armored fighting vehicles. For future landings, Dieppe clearly showed the need for preliminary artillery support, including aerial bombardment. Surprise, proper intelligence concerning enemy fortifications, avoidance of a frontal attack on a defended port, proper re-embarkation crafts. The British would develop special vehicles to provide armored beach support, and it was clear that although the RAF had kept the Luftwaffe of the naval landing crafts mostly, air dominance was key in future operations also. Artificial harbors were declared crucial. Tanks were adapted specifically for beaches, and a new integrated tactical air force strengthened ground support, and capturing a major port at the outset was now no longer seen as a priority given the construction of artificial harbors. And what did the Germans learn? As the overall theater commander in the West, General Rundstedt was adamant that the Germans must learn the lessons of this raid. It was seen clearly as a German victory and an Allied failure, given the losses. But he was not going to take a win for granted. He stated, "Just as we gained the most valuable experience from today at Dieppe, the enemy has learned as well. Just as we evaluate the experience for the future, so will the enemy. Perhaps he will do this to an even greater extent, because he paid so dearly for it." And there were practical observations were outlined in a German report testing the captured equipment. The new British Churchill tanks had met the enemy, and none have left the field of battle. Some had been equipped with cannons and flamethrowers. There were 3 models, Mark I, II, and III, had been landed. Half of the tank force had been held back in reserve offshore, in case the German defenses were stronger than expected. Thus, only 30 Churchills in the first and second waves were landed on the beach under heavy fire. The latter 2 waves were turned away. One of the tanks were trapped in the landing craft by shell fire. 11 others were mobilized on the beach. So altogether, 15 would get off the beach and over the seawall proper onto the promenade, where their future progress were blocked by concrete defenses, as expected. The engineer demolition teams killed or pinned on the beaches had not been able to accompany the tanks for support. Thus, the tanks had been able to return to the beach. Once there, and the withdrawal had been signaled, but they themselves could not be evacuated. On the bright side, none of the Churchills had been penetrated by German anti-tank fire. Even with the tracks destroyed or bogged down in the shingles, the tank crews fought to cover the withdrawals of the infantry from the beach, and almost all were captured with their vehicles having exhausted their main gun ammunition. The tank regiment's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Johnny Andrews, were among those killed in action. The Germans also captured a copy of the Dieppe Plan, which allowed them to analyze the entire operation. General Rundstedt criticized the plan's rigidity, saying this was not an actual plan. It was more like a position paper or intended course of an exercise with very little movement for contingencies or battlefield changes. The Germans were equally unimpressed by the British tanks, however. The German inspection team wrote in their report after examining the Churchills that the armor of the tank was very thick to be true. However, the material was poor and does not compare with the armor used on German or Soviet tanks. This is also shown by the effect of the fire against the tanks. The tracks were made of very brittle material and of a clumsy design. They would fracture every time they would receive a hit, a thing that does not occur with German or Russian tracks. The armor is of considerable angle of impact, however, the shape is not modern. Conclusion, it had to be said that the British Churchill tanks in their present form were easy to combat. However, the German experts found the British tank waterproofing methods very interesting and ingenious. They reported the tanks were covered at all the connecting joints with gummed cords. All cracks and openings were, in addition, coated with sealing substance. The crews were able to blow off the gummed cords from the access doors after landing with the aid of small explosive tape. The exhaust pipes were extended at the rear up to the height of the top of the turret, and the 3 air inlets and extraction openings were protected against entry of water by sheet metal chimneys. The German report then went on to record how some of the Churchill tanks were put out of operation. They observed that in most cases hits on the track produced results in every case, even if they were hit by the small 3.7 cm AT gun. With the broken track, the tank could no longer operate. German inspectors noted that other abandoned Churchill tanks showed signs of having been hit on their armor by the 3.7 or 5 cm anti-tank gun rounds, but as previously mentioned, without penetration. The Germans also noted that several vehicles became stuck in the shingles. Tracks also apparently broke as a result of being jammed by the shingles, picked up and carried onto the upper run of the tracks. The German army inspectors carried out firing trials against the armor of the captured British tanks using all available types of anti-tank weaponry and ammunition. These results were also detailed in their report. All in all, the Germans were generally pleased with their successful defense. Whilst nothing faults in their own communications, transports, and location of support forces, but they did recognize that the Allies were certain to learn lessons from the operation. They set about improving the fixed defenses along the coast, such as close defenses positioned around the large gun positions. This was one of the improvements that we would see in the defensive clusters on the Atlantic Wall and at Normandy, that I look forward to showing you in more detail in future episodes. On the morning they landed here, after the Germans had been forewarned, because the naval engagement
The weather wasn't like this, but it feels appropriate to be here on this beach in this weather. It wasn't raining water. It was raining German machine gun fire. This is not a place you want to land with your soldiers under fire. You have enemies at an elevated position in enough numbers. You don't even need a large number of enemy soldiers. They don't even need to be well trained, and indeed, they were not the German crack troops, but sitting all along the ridge or in the pillboxes, firing down here on soldiers pinned down. There's not a whole lot of places you can go. You don't have a whole lot of options. Hoping the tanks would do it for you, and the tanks didn't.
The need for practical experience in a beach landing on the continent, I understand. But why here? It is a small port city of little strategic importance. It is a narrow beach, again surrounded by cliffs, which would funnel troops into narrow, easily defended streets, again. This would be obvious even from a tourist map. In 1942, most of the German coastal batteries were out in the open, not yet encased, as it would be done in the following years. In fact, this raid gave the Germans an insight into how the Allies would conduct an invasion, and they constructed extremely elaborate defenses and close defensive positions around their guns later, as they learned from this. They also learned how to defeat the newest British tank. And why would you bring your newest gear to a raid where even the most ardent optimist would know that many, if not all, might be captured or left behind? What was the lesson sought here? Better landing crafts? The Higgins boats were already coming offline, as was the medium and large landing crafts. Or to steal German documents and communication equipment. That being done, the Germans would change their plans by the time of D-Day anyway. Was it to learn that proper reconnaissance was important before landing? That should better have been obvious to all long before this. Nor should the need for shore bombardment and air superiority be a surprise to anybody in the military.
Now, the Germans may only have had 1,500 troops, many of them not even German nationals. It was not their crack troops here, but they had excellent positions. And when you are on an elevated position, shooting down on a possible attacking force, you are sitting in the high seat. And indeed, they were.
And landing on a narrow, well-defended beach entrenched enemies at an elevated position, that was pretty common sense of things to not do. And not detecting a small German convoy of warships heading to cross the T of your invasion force, that should certainly also have been detected by the Royal Navy, not a lesson to learn, something everyone already knew to do, but didn't that day. Many boats lost communication and landed in the wrong place. Well, this also happened on D-Day, so why was this needed to learn? And what exactly was the merits of 15 kilometers of beachfront property strewn with 1,000 dead? That can hardly be a victory. Losing 106 planes and crews, 33 ships and a destroyer, with almost 4,000 soldiers captured. What was the point here, exactly? What lessons were really learned that could not have been picked up in other ways, or should simply have been known and understood already?
My name is Tino Struckmann. I run Lost Battlefields. Every year, I travel around the world to try to bring you to all the most interesting historical military locations from modern wars and the World War II special projects, battlefields, forts, fortresses, and tunnels, everything else. Things you may not be able to see or go to yourselves. Please join me on Patreon or join Lost Battlefields through the website so you get access to all my files and my notes. It really does help, and like, follow, share here on the channel if you can. That helps too.